Morning. Thank you all for coming. My name is John Herbst and I run the Eurasia Center here at the Atlantic Council. We've got a wonderful event for you today. I will not introduce our speakers. You know who they are. You have bios of them. I'll just say something which perhaps you also all know. This is about the best group of people you could assemble to talk about the subject. The sanctions list, which just came out 2 days ago. It's the best people to talk about it with one exception. That's Andrei Illarionov, who's not here, but who's been a conspirator with the folks on the panel and work on this subject. And with that, I'll turn the floor over to Dan Fried, who will offer some introductory remarks, and we'll have our panel comment. Dan, over to you.
The Trump administration, in its first year, did a credible job of implementing the existing Russian sanctions until this week's road accident. It was a disappointment and a missed opportunity, but not, I would argue, a disaster. Okay, so what happened? Well, what happened was the administration took 2 steps with respect to CATSA, the Countering American Adversaries Act through Sanctions, Countering American Adversaries through Sanctions Act. It issued a brief and puzzling statement about Section 231, which has to do with preventing Russian arms sales. And it issued a much criticized and rather weak report pursuant to Section 241, which was supposed to identify basically a Putin power structure, those officials and business people close to the regime, close to the Kremlin. The 231 report was indirectly worded. It announced no sanctions, and it asserted that the existence of this provision in the law might have prevented some arms sales, but it gave little indication that the administration had used this provision to try to prevent them. The Section 241 report, the names that came out, appears to have been put together in haste, taken from official Russian documents, like the who's who in the Kremlin, and the Forbes list of wealthy Russians. Now, it also appears to have been insufficiently vetted, so done in haste, although the law was passed in August 2nd and had been talked about for months. This was somewhere between puzzling and inexplicable. However, buried in the report was a reference to a classified annex which included additional information required pursuant to Section 241A1. That means that perhaps in this confidential report, this classified report, which I've not seen, but which apparently has been sent to Congress, there may be a much more credible set of information. It is my understanding that serious people in the Trump administration had in fact been working on the information required in Section 241, and it may be that this classified report references that work. I can't say. I haven't seen it. But the gap between what many in Washington heard was a serious effort by the administration and what was produced 48 hours ago raises several questions. The list of names produced 2 days ago is simply not the product of a U.S. government effort. It appears to be the product of something cobbled together on the fly. the kind of midnight to 3 a.m. scramble that I wish I didn't know about from previous jobs, but sadly do. What does it all mean? If the Kremlin believes that the weak report that came out is the final word from the American government, they may discover they're mistaken. And if they conclude that America's will to resist Russian aggression has dissipated for whatever reason, and I need not speculate as to what those reasons might be, but if they believe that and act on that belief, for example, by interfering in the American midterm elections later this year, as CIA Director Pompeo suggested is their intention, they will I suspect they will discover their error. The reaction from the Congress has not been welcoming. With almost instantly, a large and important group of Democratic Party senators has issued a strong letter urging the administration reconsider its approach. And although I can't speak for the administration, I can speak from experience for other administrations where initial efforts have seemed to fall flat. Sometimes administrations can learn from their mistakes. Bottom line is, I think this was a tactical mess-up which reflects some problems within the administration, and I think an inability to understand how this rush job would be received. But it does not mean that the American will to resist Russian aggression has dissipated. It's a disappointment. They could have done better. And I suspect that some were trying to do better. But a disappointment is not a disaster. Operationally, as a former professional in this business, it was puzzling to see the administration not even defend its own case. When you're going to roll out a tough report that on a politically hot issue, you get your story out. If you drop it at midnight, you make sure that starting at 6 o'clock in the morning, there's somebody available to talk about it who's willing to talk for as many hours as it takes. They didn't do that, at least as far as I know. But operational mess-ups is not the same as strategic catastrophe. I also think that the administration may have been doing a better job on Section 231 on the defense industries than they were willing to advertise. I can't figure out why that is. But I think there may be better raw material buried in the administration than the report on January 29th indicates. Maybe that's my way of looking on the bright side. But I think that the current, what I understand is a current sense of euphoria in the Kremlin may be misplaced.
Thank you. A very, very good start to this. Andrei Illarionov, you were once a senior Kremlin official. You are an economist. How would you gauge the Russian reaction, and how do things look to you?
As for those who are associated with the Kremlin, with the regime, I would say it's a sigh of relief. Nobody in Russia ever expected such public result. And it gives me an opportunity to give my assessment of the document that I assume many in this room already have seen. Ambassador Fried has given his own assessment. I will give my own from my, let's say, Russian perspective. It is a joke. Certainly it's up to you, it's up to different people to call it whether it's good or bad, but it's definitely a joke. And it was immediately have been caught up in Russia, but I assume not only in Russia. And Russian people within an hour or two immediately identify that this document is compilation of fusion of 3 lists. One is telephone book of administration of the Russian president, another telephone book of the Russian government, another Russian Forbes publication of 96 people with worth more than $1 billion US, and the RBK publication of August last year of the state managers of state corporations. And the haste with which this compilation has happened has been demonstrated that in this list name of the person who was the head of one of the state corporation last August, but not anymore, because he has been replaced last September. So that is why people who compiled this document did not have enough time to check whether these people still occupy the same position over the last 5 months or so. So naturally, we need to look into what task has been given to the administration by the Law 3364, CATSA, Section 241. And I just certainly assume that everybody already saw it, but just remind what has been asked for. Congress has asked administration to prepare the report in which would be identification of the most significant senior political figures in the Russian Federation as determined by their closeness to the Russian regime and the net worth. We have looked in this document, we understand it does not answer this particular request. An assessment of the relationship between individuals identified under this subparagraph and President Vladimir Putin or other members of the Russian ruling elite. There is no such information over there. An identification of any indices of corruption with respect to those individuals. No. Estimated net worth and known sources of income of those individuals. No. Russian parastatal entities. ABC points. No. Exposure of key economic sectors of the United States to Russian political exposed persons and so on. No. The likely effects of imposing debt and equity restrictions on Russian parastatal entities and so on. No. And all other points. None. Once again, none of the points identified in the Section 241 has been reflected in the document that we have seen from yesterday night. What is very important, certainly, that's once again, that's a joke, but there is a hope, but so far not confirmed hope, that there is classified part of this document. And Secretary Mnuchin yesterday in his remarks in Congress has hinted that there is classified part of the document is pretty different one. He has said, I'm trying to quote him, that it is a result of extraordinary work. It contains thorough analysis. It contains hundreds pages. except of this information about this document, we don't have much else. So that is why we should trust the words of the Secretary of Treasury. But it's rather hard to comment on the document that nobody has seen so far. So, but there is one little caveat with this story. The Section 241 of CATSA explicitly says, it's a point B, form of report. The report required under subsection A shall be submitted in an unclassified form, but may contain a classified annex. And from that, I'm forced to conclude that the section of Section 241 is not fulfilled by what we have seen by publication of January 29th. We certainly can hope that classified part of this work that has been submitted to the committees of the Congress may contain the responses to this law. But until we can see this document, we cannot comment the substance of this part. Thank you.
Andrei, thank you. Andrei Piontkovsky, your views on this?
Well, I just to follow my colleague and try to clarify why this additional information demanded by Section 241 is so important. It's so important politically and legally. Russian opposition for many years, for decades, have asked, called, appealed, insisted that the United States of America make a very simple thing. Well, not introduce some new sanction, not make some tough diplomatic moves, but just implement its own legislation. There is a legislation in the United States on fighting with laundering of money got in criminal ways. And there is powerful structures working on implementing this legislation, Financial Action Task Force, Financial Crime Enforcement, and so on. And why they don't apply this legislation to billions and billions of dollars of Russian kleptocracy, which is accumulated here in the United States. And even we, the people who analyze it and draw attention of American public and American authority to this phenomena, we were shocked by the latest revelation on National Bureau of Economic Research that dimension of private Russian asset in the United States, it's around $1 billion. I even didn't dare to pronounce this figure. It's astronomic figure. It's not robbery of century, it's robbery of millennium. And the importance of this Section 241 is that for the first time it made a first step to this section, because it very clearly demanded executive to present them not only this list of Kremlin telephone book, but additional information on any person included in this book. Net worth, sources of income, including relatives, indices of corruption, and what is also very important, the list of assets in the United States. After this, if this information were made public, no new sanctions are needed. This is enough information just to apply American legislation about against laundering of criminal money. It's one part of this story. And the second enormous political effect of this, of publication of this data demanded by American law is exposure this information to Russian people. Well, everybody in Russia knows that we are run by kleptocracy. But when the public will present it with very detailed information how $1 trillion is robbed from Russian people by his leaders, the top of its leadership. Paraphrasing the famous historical saying of Winston Churchill, I may say that never in the history of human conflict so many have been robbed of so much by so few. And so this few is the list of Russian executive oligarch demanded by Section 241. So certainly the people who edited made a very serious blow to our efforts to undermine both internally and externally position of Russian kleptocracy. But as Ambassador Fried formulated yesterday, is the reporting, but it's not catastrophe. I am more optimistic maybe even than my colleague. I'm 100% sure that this information is presented in classified version, because if not, it would be such open breaking of the law by a person who prepared a late night report that it will lead to very serious legal consequences for them. It seems to me that a positive program now, it demands or ask our friends in Congress who got this report to make this information, to declassify this information about financial crimes of Russian top leadership. And I assure you that it will be greeted by majority of Russian people, because, as I said, it will lead to the action of American legal system, and finally to freezing and confiscating these assets, and well, the honest American policeman should return the stolen wallet to the victim of the crime. The only problem will be that people who now officially represent Russian state are the same criminal who robbed Russian people. So I hope that this money will be finally confiscated and returned to the first Russian post-mafia government.
Whoa, that's very interesting hope and expectation. We've heard a lot of criticism and pessimism on the council, on this panel regarding what's happened. But it's also worth recalling that around this time a year ago, we were hearing that the Trump administration was going to be reviewing sanctions. And instead, they set in motion a process which led to sanctions legislation. And we already are seeing some pushback from Congress regarding this latest, admittedly weak step by the administration. So, Laura, what do you have to say about this?
Yeah, I think it's a really, first of all, I just want to commend, I think, really good remarks to build on from the rest of the panel first. But I think that it's a really important point, John, about the fact that the most bipartisan piece of legislation, in fact, the only really true bipartisan, nearly unanimous piece of legislation that has been passed since Trump took office was this sanctions legislation. It was nearly unanimous in both houses of Congress, it was completely veto-proof. The president reportedly was considering vetoing it, but it was going to become law no matter what. And so I think that it is incredibly important, especially when it comes to the point that Dan was making about, should the Kremlin be taking any comfort in the publication of this joke of a list? I would also join in the use of that word. And I think that in the near term, sure, maybe there's reasons for the Kremlin to take comfort, but I think it's incredibly important to bear in mind the congressional resolve on this issue. And we saw late last night a letter from about 20 Democratic senators reaction out of the House of Representatives as well, with leadership there. I think that this is an issue that Congress is not going to let go. Congress put a lot of their weight behind the original piece of legislation. They have skin in this game, and they are going to want to see the White House actually follow through and not actually humiliate them, which is, I think, what we actually see playing out right now. So I would expect the congressional pushback to actually continue to build over time. I do think that there is potential question about what's in the classified versions of this, giving some fodder for additional congressional action. But what I want to do is take a bit of a step back to building on some of Andrei's very good remarks about sort of the original context for this money, what it means, why it's significant. To also talk about why this legislation was passed in the first place. It was passed for two reasons. One, to serve as a deterrent for future Russian interference in American and European elections. And two, to raise the costs on doing so. Now, deterrence depends on a credible threat of action. And through its actions this week, and in particular through a really poorly done statement from the State Department, the administration has undermined the credibility of their deterrent threats. And that is a blow that carries well beyond just, I think, this particular question. It is not only something that Putin will take a lesson from. Putin understands strength. Putin understands following through with your threats. He also understands pulling punches. And that's what happened here. But other adversarial nations will also be watching and taking notes. Dan mentioned the CIA director's comments about his belief that Russia intends to interfere in the US midterm elections this year. He also noted that China is a significant threat when it comes to this kind of interference activity as well. And so my concern is that we do in fact have the tools necessary to defend ourselves, to deter this kind of activity, to impose costs. However, we are refusing to use them, and that is enormously problematic. One other note, just going back to what Andrei called the robbery of the millennium. And I think it's really important, again, bearing in mind why this piece of legislation was so important in the first place, is that Putin is trying to hit the United States and our European partners and allies at what he believes to be one of our strengths, our democratic core. And he's trying to weaken us there. And so it's really important when we think about how do we hit back, what does Putin really care about? Well, Putin cares about his power. Putin cares about his money. He has a network of proxies that help him carry out his malign efforts around the world. This report was in part intended, as Andrei eloquently put, to expose those assets, to expose those individuals, in part to serve as a deterrent, in part to raise costs, in part to hit Putin in a place where he cares about. And I think that when we do think going forward about the ways that we can be really taking meaningful action to deter efforts to undermine democracies, this really is an incredibly important area, and that's why I think it is so important that Congress, everyone on the outside who cares about these issues, other governments, and even those who, as Dan noted, within this administration who were trying to put things in a different direction, continue to fight that fight, because I think it is just a really, really critical area.
All right, let me ask a question for any of you to consider. It's clear in the months before the list came out, there was palpable concern in Moscow about this list. And we saw people coming through Washington from Russia or on behalf of Russians interested in this. Laura, you just made the point that you think that our sanctions as a deterrence took a blow with this list. How serious a blow? Do we think that as a result of this, we may see future Kremlin miscalculations? I hope that's anyone on the panel.
It's possible. I can't answer that with confidence because there are too many unknown variables. What does Putin believe his relationship with President Trump is, and what was it? That's not the area of this panel. That's being discussed in Washington every day. But that's a significant variable which will affect his calculation. However, aside from that, Laura rightly pointed out that the American body politic is poised to resist Russian aggression, with or without the White House. And the reaction to this, I might as well use it, joke of a list suggests that the Russians may have to rethink their current euphoria and not try to draw operational conclusions.
Okay, you made a very important point, and others have made it as well, about Congress's reaction and more broadly the reaction of the American political system to the two Andreis. Do you think this is understood in Moscow, that in fact their current euphoria may just be that, a short-lived thing, that there are dangers lurking for a revisionist Kremlin in the Washington political system?
John, I would probably use a slightly different word, not euphoria, even to describe the state of the mind in Russia, in Moscow, let's say yesterday. In addition to joke, I would say it's a shock, but it's a different type of shock. It's not a shock from what they expected, but shock as they found the way of the current administration is working. I think it's just feeling of disbelief that it is possible that a U.S. administration can work in such a way. And they could not understand, whether it's a deliberate operation to cover up something really serious, or it's just a blunder. And such a shock existed until this morning, when people trying to produce some kind of conspiracy theory why it has happened with intervention of U.S. intelligence in replacing these texts and so on, which is just demonstrates the kind of the level of disbelief that it is ever possible that American administration would produce such a document. So that is why they still could not understand, and the reputation of some elements of administration fell substantially deep. And finding out that it was replacement by some particular people due to unknown reason is probably restoration of some reputation, because it's not they thought, because even that would be the fact that would be considered here in Washington is an acceptable fact. Now is considered in Moscow as at least partial restoration of reputation, because nobody could believe that it can be done in such way about this compilation of these 4 lists. It's one part of the story, but the other part of the story is a little bit more worrisome, because many of you yesterday have heard President Trump and his State of the Union address. And as you probably recall, that Russia has been mentioned once, along with China, as a rival. But it is interesting, when he went to the section of his speech concerning sanctions, he at length discussed issue of Iran, North Korea, and he has not mentioned Russia even once.
Right.
And that's exactly the cards that we're discussing the 3 countries. And he was very eager and willing to discuss sanctions against Iran, North Korea, Cuba and Venezuela in that section of his speech, but it was a conspicuous absence of Russia and that particular part of the speech in the day or day after this report, so-called Kremlin Report, has been released. And definitely many people in Moscow would be much more sure about possible link between the so-called substance or content of this Kremlin report on January 29th and absence of mentioning Russia in the section part of Mr. Trump's speech yesterday.
I will address that, but before I do that, I'd like to give Andrei a chance to comment.
The Russian reaction, the Kremlin reaction, was rather naive. It was very interesting to follow its dynamic during Creator's Day. The day, watching their 24 hours political show, the day before releasing the report, the atmosphere was hysterical. I tell you one very interesting scene. One very important Duma, I don't remember his name, but he one of the deputy Duma speakers. The day before releasing. Yesterday, or rather, the main subject was Trump is a well progressive, reasonable, rational politician, and he protected us from Russophobic version of Kremlin Report. And I even suspect that they were so obsessed with looking through this list of oligarchs and executives, they even did not notice this small forward to the report printed by very small letters with this reference to classified section where all demands of section 241, as we hope, fulfilled.
I'd like to pick up personally on the point that Andrei Illarionov made. The president's non-mention of sanctions in the State of the Union, sanctions on Russia, is absolutely consistent with that peculiar sympathy that we've seen him having for the Kremlin and for Mr. Putin personally since he emerged as a campaign candidate 2 years ago. It's worth pointing out that the strength of the Trump administration's sanctions policy ultimately rests in the first instance with Congress, and he merely went along. So what we've seen in Trump policy towards Russia is ultimately a stronger and a wiser policy than his predecessors. But it was a policy that seemed to gain impetus from the president's advisors as well as from Congress, not from the president himself. So in that sense, there's no contradiction between a stronger policy towards Russia, yet President Trump not mentioning sanctions in his State of the Union. It's also worth noting, so that we don't get too pessimistic, that this very strange decision on sanctions came only 5 weeks after the administration's decision to send javelins to Ukraine. Now there too, I'm not sure I would credit Mr. Trump with it, but since he's the president, he ultimately is responsible. So we have overall a stronger Russia policy today than we had a year ago under the Trump administration, although it may not be the president's initiative that explains it. Daniel.
That's true, but a caveat. What explains your working hypothesis is that the professional level of the government and the Congress managed to go around the mysterious reluctance of the presidents to take seriously Russia's revisionist threat. So That language is included in the national security strategy, but not in the president's description of the national security strategy. The administration implements Russia sanctions in a responsible, fair way. I would have been happy to sign off, I associate myself, were I in government, with the previous steps. The Javelin decision.
Right.
Obama administration didn't make it, Trump administration does. So your thesis works up until 48 hours ago, when at the work done, let us say by the if we're right, and if the stories circulating in Washington are accurate, the professional level of government was doing what it does, which is to implement the sanctions, including Section 241, in a responsible way. That went sideways. We don't know why. Moscow doesn't know why, and there are all kinds of speculations, as Andrei Illarionov said. But this is where Laura's pessimism is impossible to refute, because the thesis that the professional level of government can carry this policy and in some cases do better than Obama, for which there's, you can make that case, right, with respect to javelins and a few other things, falls apart with this important case. And I suspect, knowing Washington, that we will know more. And what I find utterly baffling is that, well, is Russia a sensitive political topic? Are there like investigations going on with it? Are there people interested in knowing why weird things happen with respect to Russia policy? So, like, if you're going to do something on Russia, don't you want to make sure you're not going to be vulnerable to the kinds of questions which we're at? And I think in the short term, this is what should have been a strong symbol, a strong American position and a significant deterrent, and a signal to Russia that their attacks on our elections have triggered a response. That's all eclipsed. And we'll get past it, and the Kremlin shouldn't overinterpret it, but boy, in the short term, it's ugly.
I like to joust with Dan, but my responsibility as a moderator is to give Laura the floor.
Sure.
I don't want to interrupt the jousting. I'm directly in the middle here, but to duck out. No, I just want to add 2 points to what Dan said. The first is, I think you're right, of course, to point to a series of tactical, discrete decisions that have been forward-leaning with respect to taking on Russian aggression, some of which is simply implementation of law, some of which is, I believe, as Dan said, the professional levels being able to carry the day. We actually haven't seen an articulation of a Russia policy, per se. The national security strategy is the closest that we've come to seeing elements of a view towards Russia, although, again, it's not clear that that reflects the president's views himself. We hear a lot of things about a Russia policy being developed by the National Security Council, by very good people who are there, but we have actually not seen a Russia policy. And I think that it's really important to make that distinction, because really dealing with, the U.S. relationship with Russia is very complicated. It has a lot of different elements. And I think it is important to put it in that broader context, number one. But number two, the other element of any good, I would argue, U.S. policy towards Russia is a very strong transatlantic relationship and very strong cooperation with our partners and allies, and making sure that we are in lockstep, particularly in the NATO context. That is where this administration has taken us leaps and bounds backwards. I think that the continued concern that we see in European capitals about this administration's resolve, about the nature of those relationships, about the nature of commitments to NATO, finally having dragged out reiterations of standing by Article 5 notwithstanding. I do think that that is an element that can't be put to the side, even when looking at discrete decisions like javelins.
Fair point. Andrei.
John, your comments reminded me something that happened 18 years ago, exactly these days of the year, in Davos. When the Russian delegation arrived to the World Economic Forum, the journalist from the United States had asked a question: who is Mr. Putin? And as we remember, there was a silence followed by laugh. So it seems to me, to some extent, the story is repeating, but now in Washington, and people over the last year is asking similar question to your president, and asking what is his position towards different directions. From my point of view, it looks like I may mistake, but it seems to me that his approach towards Ukraine is substantially different compared to his approach towards relation with the Moscow, with Kremlin, with Mr. Putin himself. So that is why it's a difference between so-called geopolitical type of thinking and personal type of thinking, or might be something like that. But definitely, I have a feeling that you would not have the definite answer for this particular question, who is Mr. Trump, maybe for some time. But what is clearly, we have seen, especially today, that we're supposed to discuss here, at least I thought about that, we will be discussing more what is going on in Russia, and what is going with the Russian administration, what's actually we supposed to discuss this part, but instead of discussing what's going on in Washington. That is one of the unavoidable results of the report that has been published on, so-called report published, or joke that has been made on January 29th. So that's a result, that's a visible result. Instead of discussing serious and important for Russia, for America, for the whole world stories, we're discussing something different.
Well,
Quite.
Andrei, please.
May I return to the question, who is Mr. Putin, rather than who is Mr. Trump? The reaction, the personal reaction of Mr. Putin to this version of Kremlin Report was very significant. He evidently he was very pleased, and he tried to present himself yesterday in very conciliatory way, and he repeated for 1,000th time his main mantra: we need each other to fight together this international terrorism. And let me a bit return to this issue of Tsarnaev's and Boston Marathon. Not because I recall it, Putin recalled it for the 10th or 20th time. This story about Tsarnaev is his favorite story. Well, we warned Americans. They did not heed to our warning, and this is results. So, do you want to be against subject to a terrorist attack, or you finally begin cooperation with us? I suspect this was a message of secret visit of Mr. Narishkin in Washington also. But I suspect that 90% of audience here don't know the basic fact about Tsarnaev case, which undermines Putin's story completely. His story is in 2011, we twice won 2 minutes.
Please.
It's I think important for understanding the crucial issue, who is Mr. Putin. We warned American intelligence that Tsarnaev are terrible Islamic extremists. They did not react, and the result in 2013, the bomb attack. This story missed one very important element. Yes, they warned America, both I think CIA and FBI, and but without presenting any evidence, and the Americans have no basis to arrest them. But in 2012, Tsarnaev, who was claimed by Kremlin to be a very dangerous Islamic terrorist, flew to Moscow by Delta airplane, not by secretly, by certainly in Sheremetyevo. He was met by secret services because he was in all datas. And he traveled in Russia, in Dagestan, in Chechnya for 8 months under control security. Extremists were killed after meeting with him, but he was safe and well. he returned to Moscow, and they sent him back to Washington. So very simple question. If Kremlin regarded Tsarnaev such dangerous terrorist, why he provided him such hospitality for 8 months in 2011 and sent him back to United States? And the fact that Putin again and again returning to this history just confirms this very serious suspicion and very serious question. Not speaking about scandalous story with American diplomats who was arrested when American congressmen came to Moscow just to explore Tsarnaev ties. So this is a very old game. And immediately our Boston Marathon, this propaganda campaign began. We need each other. We should cooperate with against terrorism and all usual singers like Dmitry Simes, Tom Graham, Kissinger. They repeated, "We need Russian," and to make Russian to cooperate in fighting in terrorism, we should close eyes on Ukraine. It's a distracting issue, and so on and so on. And now Putin, very much enchanted by what he regarded yesterday as success, returning to this policy of duping Americans.
No, thank you. That's very interesting. And let me just make a broad point, which I think you understand, but just to be sure. Sanctions are a very technical and narrow issue. But in fact, the reasons why we're all in this room, the reason why it's so important, because it relates to the overall question of large power relations, and as seen from, I think, the standpoint of all of our panelists, as an important tool for making Russian revisionism a much harder thing to achieve its objectives. And with that, let's open the floor to questions. Ambassador Courtney, please identify yourself. Someone's coming with a microphone.
Thank you, Bill Courtney with the RAND Corporation. Especially given the large bipartisan support for CATSA, for the sanctions bill, is it likely that Congress will press to have declassified parts of the classified report? Or, on the contrary, because of the fight now over releasing of the Devin Nunes report, is this something Democrats would be likely to support, but Republicans would not be likely to support?
Tough question. Good question. Very thoughtful.
I think there's a lot of frustration in the Congress. It's most visible on the part of the Democrats. I think a lot of Republicans share it. I have no idea how it will play out. I think we'll see a tussle for the next few weeks. I don't think we're through with this initial phase because of the evident sloppiness of the report and all the other issues you've raised. So all I can say is watch this space. Democrats are frustrated and they're trying to make common cause with the Republicans, as far as I know.
Well, do you want to comment on this? You don't have to.
No, I mean, I actually have exactly the same question, so I'm not sure I have a good answer to it. But I think it's the right question to be asking. But I do think it is a very complicated environment, both around the set of issues on Russia and classified material.
Watching American political scene for a year, I suspect very much that this classified part will be leaked in a matter of several weeks.
Another message.
Only if the deep state is as strong as some people say it is. Okay, over here.
Hi, Ashley Steinberg. I'm a sanctions lawyer at Hogan Lovells. My question is, what action do you think Russian oligarchs are going to take in response to this list, given that this isn't a sanctions list, but really just a informational thing? I mean, what happens next on their part?
It isn't even really informational.
Fair enough.
An analysis, a serious analysis of sort of the Putin power structure as called for in 241, might have put them in a difficult position. It too would not have been a sanctions list, but it would have cast a shadow over them, and banks would have had to do a serious attempt at de-risking. They would have gone through that exercise. But, you know, and I can't speak for banks, but my sense is that when bankers and consulting firms understand what was published and what wasn't, it will have marginal effect. Because if you're identifying everybody, you've identified nobody. And so I don't think that there is even a kind of residual cloud, a de-risking element for any of this. I think it's a complete pass because the administration, in its haste, did not even concoct a, you know, it wasn't even plausible. It was a risible product.
If I can say, you're talking about the information value of this list. Frankly speaking, I don't see any new information value from what has been published.
Right.
Because in this part, it is a list of the Russian Forbes, 96 names. All these 96 people have seen this list long before. They know that they are in that list. So that is why for them there is nothing new. It's a first. Second, the term oligarch that has been used even in the law itself by Congress, I think it's probably not the best one. Because it has association in the modern language with a rich person. And it's exactly as the so-called report is interpreting as a person who has more than $1 billion. But the original meaning of the word oligarch is just as a oligarchy, and kind of very few or several people who have power. So that is why its meaning is slightly different. And even in the modern sense, even in the Russian sense, it would be several people who have money but definitely have power. So that is why including people from the Forbes list, regardless of how much money do they have, it does not mean oligarchs. That's a kind of missing point completely. So that is why it's making all pictures completely wrong. So that is why just much more actually value in calling by name, by term oligarchs, some people who probably do not have much money, I mean just maybe not tens of billion US dollars, but who have real levels of power in Kremlin. They would be considered oligarchs because they have power and they have some money as well. So that is why I think that just the approach, and also as you remember, to deter, to some kind of to make them think what is better to do or not to do. So it's better to find slightly different terms.
Well, I would say that public exposure of this Russian trillion is much more important than just punishing Russian top executive or deterring them from some dangerous aggressive action. It's more fundamental. It undermines the foundations, the raison d'etre of Russian kleptocratic system. It was created not by Putin, but before him, to let the top people do two things: pillage Russian resources and accumulate it in Western financial institutions. And this exposure, irrespectively of further process, how long, how much time it would take to freeze and to confiscate, it put ends to this system. This model, quarter of century model of Russian kleptocratic system could not be work any longer. It would be something different.
Okay, thank you. Next question. Thank you. You have to. No, no, first. No. First this lady, and then you.
Very much. Good morning, everybody. My name is Ekaterina Sobol. I'm from Russian news agency RIA Novosti. And first off, I was talking to my colleagues from Forbes, big hive for American administration. They made their work more difficult. Nobody wants to talk to them after all of that. And my question to everybody, and maybe particularly to Daniel, what is about Russian oligarchs from opposition? It is very big political and business risk for them to be in this list. I know there is a lot of people who were investing to Facebook, Twitter, and everywhere else in the United States, and what to do with this risk and how to solve this problem. Thank you.
Well, you're certainly correct that going after wealthy Russians as a group makes no sense. That's not what the law was intended, and that's exactly what the administration did. You know, what were they thinking? If the purpose of Section 241 was to differentiate between the Russian elite that is close to, not just close to Putin, but part of his power structure, and that which is either independent or, to be more realistic, has to, let us say, kiss his ring. And there is a difference. There is a difference between operating under Russian conditions now and being part of the Putin apparatus. And it's important to make those distinctions. There are various interesting hints that the classified annex was a deeper analysis. If you know how to read these things, it says right here in the published report, such persons in the annex may hold a position below those included in the unclassified report or have a net worth below $1 billion. That suggests that somebody did person-by-person analysis, which is the point. Because, as I said earlier, if you go after everybody, you're not going after anyone. You're just saying you're anti-Russian. Now, that's stupid. And this was a terribly wasted opportunity. The point of Section 241 was to signal to individual members of the Russian elite that they should maybe do their best to stay away, be seen as staying away from the Putin power structure, and as a class, that they'd all be better off if Russia didn't invade its neighbors or attack Western democracies, and that we were going to hold individuals responsible. Now that's a powerful message. And even if that list came out but had no sanctions, it would be a powerful message. And don't credit me with observing that. Look at the reaction in Moscow up to 48 hours ago. Why were they worried? Because they were worried, it seems to me, because they believed that a differentiated analysis would come out and it would have this effect. The administration threw that all away. There's an old adage, when you have to choose between malevolence and incompetence, it's usually incompetence. But, to say that that's the charitable explanation, mere incompetence. All right, and there may be others. But your question is certainly right. And it's just puzzling, to say the least, because the administration at the professional level knew this, all of what I said, perfectly well.
Okay, question over here, and then a question over there.
Morning, I'm Volodymyr Muzilov from the Embassy of Ukraine. First of all, I would like to stress that we hope that administration will continue to strengthen the US sanction policy against Russia, in particular by imposing sanctions against Russian energy pipelines, first of all. And also the question. So yesterday, Secretary Mnuchin mentioned during hearing at the Senate that the Treasury will use the information in the classified part of the report for further sanction policy against Russia. And also, State Department yesterday during the briefing, they mentioned that they will go forward in implementing of the Section 2-for-1 against Russian defense and intelligence sector. Actually, the question is, how do you feel, what should be some kind of trigger or like actions from Russian side, like some kind of aggression or something like that, or like additional influence in the United States, for administration to start acting, to implement all these new sanctions? Thank you.
Daniel?
Well, I noticed Secretary Mnuchin's comments, and the administration, one of the inexplicable things about the administration's rollout of this report is that it didn't even argue its own best case. Like, okay, let's pretend as a thought experiment. Let's throw away the joke of a list, okay? Throw that away. If we had a classified report about which we know only what's in the published report, and we had and if the administration had led with Secretary Mnuchin's comments that we may use this classified list as the basis for further sanctions if Russia is aggressive, and then they throw in CIA Director Pompeo's statement about Russia's intention in our midterms. Well, you have a pretty good basis for a more reasonable administration case, and in that case, our discussion this morning would sound very different. So they had, they weakened their own policy by that bad list, and then by not explaining what they were doing. For example, I suspect the State Department was using Section 231 on defense trade to caution governments around the world against it. They hinted as much, sort of buried in that weirdly worded State Department statement was kind of the suggestion that they had done that. Well, then come out and say so and get the credit for it. So, this is me drifting back to acknowledge John Herbst's points that the actual policy may be better in some cases than it sounds. But boy, when you need to do an exegesis to come up with what ought to be top lines in any competent rollout, you're dealing with, you may not be dealing with malevolence, but it sure is incompetence if you want to be charitable. And I'm trying to look on the bright side.
Also trying to look for bright side. I would like to sort of attract attention to the fact that the so-called unclassified part of this report has not appeared on any of the sites of any government institutions in the United States.
Maybe they're embarrassed.
Neither on Treasury, nor on State, nor on Energy. Which probably is a good indication that those people, and actually it has been done in a way of leaks to the mass media, to Associated Press, to Bloomberg, to Financial Times, and so on, which probably is a good indication of how those people who were forced to prepare in the last 20 minutes this report considered this so-called document. So that is why they did not want to take any responsibility for these documents. So that is why they are probably sending signal to all of us, it is a joke.
Okay. Question over here. Turn to your right.
Great, on my right. Hi, Paul Massaro. I'm the Anti-Corruption Policy Advisor at the U.S. Helsinki Commission on the Hill. Fabulous panel, thank you so much. So while we're looking on the bright side, I actually had a question about Brian Whitmore's commentary on this. He took a very positive take. He said, look, the breadth of the list is good. It puts everybody on notice that if you get involved with the regime, you're gonna be looked at, you're gonna be targeted for sanctions. Is there any currency to that take on this list? Thanks.
In addition to what already Daniel has said, John said, Andrei said, everybody said here, I would say, in this list you would easily find not only that person that I mentioned, who was the former manager of the state corporation, which he's already not there. So that what is the kind of value in putting the person who is already maybe retired on in some other position? What is the value in putting into this list the head of Federal Archive Service? I have worked in Kremlin for almost 6 years. I know those people, they are not related to power to any extent. They are very different people. And I actually have a suspicion that probably he never met Mr. Putin in his life. So what is the purpose to put his name as a senior political figure determined by their closeness to the Russian political regime? It is a joke. Once again, another person as a kind of the head of federal kind of Фельдъегерская служба, service, something like sending information. It's a kind of, it's a government job for any government. It's not political regime. It's a kind of function of any government. What is the purpose of that? And there are many other cases, so that is why. The case of these rich people then has described it very well. So it's not only missing the point, it makes more harm than good. Because instead of splitting wrong people, it's uniting wrong people with good people, or with neutral people. So that is why I don't see any value at all. Certainly, once again, in the very best case, it's a joke, and probably it's not a very good joke, but just it's rather hard to find any kind of value, instead, with one exception, value for Mr. Putin. Because for Mr. Putin, that's absolutely unquestionable value, because he can present these documents as the attempt of Americans who are all Russophobic, because for them all Russians are the same face, and they would like to put into the one list. Mr. Putin and the Kremlin regime would win from this publication enormously, but not normal people.
Anyone else want to comment on that?
I just want to add, I think that last point is really important about this feeding into the narrative of lumping all Russians, all wealthy Russians, all powerful Russians necessarily together. I think that's a
especially
really,
the head
really
of Federal
important
Archive Agency. That's a crucial person in the Russian political regime efforts.
The purpose, one of the deeper purposes of a proper Kremlin report would be to show the Russian society that the Americans know who's who, that we are not, in fact, Russophobic, but we know who is responsible for getting Russia into wars with its neighbors, fights with the Americans and the Europeans, and at the same time, authoritarianism and backwardness at home. And you can't do that if you just throw out a name of wealthy Russians. Then you've conveyed ignorance and non-discriminatory irritation. So now that I understand that that Whitmore might have been trying to look on the bright side, but no, that's too much even for me.
Everything that you just heard is important and interesting, but I think Brian, who are concerned about their business relationships, because they include some of the people on that list. So I think there still is a positive impact, although it was, I agree with everyone on the panel, not a particularly skillful exercise, and also it could have been far better than it was. Okay, other questions? All the way in the back.
Mike Moore with EWSA. Earlier this week, the first ever Russian cargo of LNG offloaded at Everett Terminal to Boston. There's a second cargo on its way due to unload on February 15th. This is equity LNG production from Yamal that transshipped in Europe, and it's coming to the States. The storyline is it's Total's LNG, but it's actually part of CNPC's and Bank of China's equity production from Yamal. Is it possible that China has a hand in what the administration's up to these days?
I don't know. Two, I think there are ample reasons for this, tactical train wreck without injecting China. Okay, I think they did this all by themselves.
Okay. Question over here.
Valentina Polunina, Der Spiegel. Do you think the release
I'm sorry, from where?
Der Spiegel. Do you think the release of the list will have an impact on the sanctions policy in Europe?
Oh boy.
Go.
The Europeans are likely scratching their heads and, probably writing this off to another example of the current exotic American political climate. Like as a diplomat, I was often in countries where the politics were exciting. I didn't think I'd be, Washington would become one of those capitals. And I don't mean exciting in a good way. I think Europe deserves enormous credit for steadiness on sanctions. I think that I've given the Trump administration credit for administering the existing sanctions in a reasonable way. I think another missed opportunity was to work with Europe on a common approach to combating Russian election interference, disinformation, and Ukraine-related sanctions. And had I been in government, I would have been going to, Brussels, Paris, Berlin, all the time and work out a common position. And we haven't done that because it is still a contentious issue whether, as a government, we can fully recognize that this actually exists, which is a problem. But I think Europe's probably just scratching its head and wondering what in the world they should make of this.
Question right there.
I'm Tristan Byrne. I'm an energy analyst at Capital Alpha Partners. If we sort of take Mnuchin's comments at their word and we think that this classified report does result in some sort of potential sanctions action on these individuals, what's sort of the scope of those actions? Is it just directly targeting their assets? Is there a secondary sanctions component? What could we see?
Well, first, the administration would have to decide, and there was an earlier question about what the triggers are. Additional attacks on our elections, additional aggression against Ukraine. So you have to figure out what bad behavior it is you're going to respond to. And then you have to signal that, right? It doesn't do any good if nobody knows. All right, so that's he's put on the Treasury OFAC, Office of Foreign Asset Control, SDN list, specially designated national. That means their assets are blocked. They can't use the dollar. They become basically radioactive for the American financial system and anybody who works with and through the American financial system. So basically European banks and most every bank. It's not secondary sanctions is an overused term. It means that they lose access to the dollar writ large in its full extent, full stop, for a long time. That's pretty good. That's a pretty good sanction. That hits pretty hard. So you don't put it on for no reason, and you make sure everybody knows why you're putting it on. If that's, when the dust settles, what we may end up with is Secretary Mnuchin's comment that we're going to draw from the classified list for sanctions if the Russians misbehave. Now, that's not my favorite way to do it. I would have liked the list to have been made public. But it's not a terrible place to be. It's just, they're going to have to put themselves through some pain before they get there. How much suffering do they want to inflict on themselves before they crawl out of this self-made mess and actually come up with a rational policy which is already sort of indirectly outlined in what they've done, I hope.
Other questions? Anyone on the panel want to? Oops, okay, please.
Hi, Greg Walters, Vice News. I've got a quick question. Someone who's not on the panel today, Anders Asland, wrote on the Atlantic Council website yesterday.
Who?
Anders Asland wrote that at the last minute, that serious experts were working on a serious list, and that at the last minute, somebody high up threw out the experts' work and instead wrote down the names of the top officials and the 96 billionaires on the Forbes list, suggesting, and I guess what I'm asking is whether, how much credibility you guys give this assertion that basically at the last minute we saw a late night political intervention here. It seems that that's what's maybe being suggested, but I'm wondering if you could put a finer point on it.
You take this.
That's why he's looking at me. I mean, I haven't had the direct conversations that Anders has, but my understanding is in fact that that is a credible story. And I think, I know a number of, I mean, the Treasury spokesperson, of course, confirmed to Foreign Policy Magazine that it was, in fact, the Forbes list. I think we know, a couple of other data points here. One is that Dan and Anders, as well as many others, were also in touch with professionals in the U.S. government who were working diligently through this report, sort of knew at different stages where the process stood, and have reason to know that what popped out the other side is not, in fact, what was being discussed along the way. Dan should chime in if I'm misrepresenting that. But I think that there's, I definitely think that there is reason to believe that that's the case, which is of deep concern, of course.
I haven't seen the annex, but I believe that professionals in the government were, and not just working level, but serious people were doing serious work to prepare something, and that is suggested. I believe that's true. What happened when it reached the principals level, I can't say. But something did, and I think it was late. So, Anders' piece has a ring of credibility, but I don't know whether it was one person, several person, don't know who. I just don't know.
Other questions? Well, we've just about exhausted our time. Anyone on the panel want to offer a parting shot? All right, well, thank you very much for the panel. Thank you all for coming.